there's a lot of interaction and interplay between those that need the system, those that maintain the system, and I mentioned the ports, the lower river ports and the upper river ports, who are investing in infrastructure, who are enabling economic development and growth for the communities to do that.
Welcome back to DAM, the official podcast of Northwest Hydropower. I'm your host, Austin Rohr. Today, we continue our exploration of Marine Highway 84 and the topic of river navigation. We've dedicated time to capturing the perspective of an inland port, one of the larger barge operating businesses, and more recently, the farmers who rely on the river to transport their crops. Now, we'll take a look at the bigger overall picture of the system. And perfectly positioned to do so is none other than a similar organization to our own, the Pacific Northwest Waterways Association. I'm joined today in the DAM studio by the executive director and fan of the podcast, Neil Maunu, who's here to share what PNWA is all about. Neil, I'm so glad we were able to make this happen.
Thanks for having me. And kudos, because you got my name right the first time. That's huge extra points. It makes up for you saying that I'm going to perfectly explain here. So we'll see. I'll do my best.
I'd like to add, too, I didn't ask beforehand. I've had plenty of time. We've been on a lot of meetings over the last year or so I've had some time to kind of pick up and practice that one.
Well, it goes a long way.
Awesome. Well, I guess the first thing to kick off with is maybe to talk a little bit about the association itself. So give us some background on what the Pacific Northwest Waterways Association is and the kind of work that you do.
Sure. So we, Pacific Northwest Waterways Association, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan industry trade association, so 501c6, if you're tracking that. We do federal advocacy. So we advocate for federal policies and funding, supporting regional economic development. We advocate for basically efficient, reliable, and environmentally sustainable waterways. Founded in 1934, so we just celebrated our 90th anniversary last year. Founded as the Inland Empire Waterway Association. So if you're a history buff, there's a dam here. You've probably talked about it on your podcast, Bonneville Dam. Bonneville Dam and the Navlock was IEWA's first order of business. We petitioned the Roosevelt administration in Congress in 1934 to have a navigation lock put in.
And what an improvement that was.
Oh my gosh! Yeah, set the stage. Yeah.
Yeah. And as far as your own path, I mean, talking about the 90-year history, but for your own history coming into this job, how did you find yourself in the position to become executive director of the organization?
Luck. No, I took a little different path than some of my predecessors or some folks that have been in industry associations. I came from industry. So I didn't come from the GR, government relations advocacy side. I came from industry. So prior to this role, which I've been here about a year and a half now at PNWA, prior to this role, I was at Tidewater Barge Lines, and we'll talk about hopefully in a bit some of the barge lines and tug operators here on the river system. And I ran business development and sales for Tidewater for 5 or 6 years. So that's, again, primarily, and we'll talk about it, sort of upriver, up the Snake all the way to Lewiston. Before that, I spent about 9 years on the operations side in what I would call and break down the lower river, so lower Columbia, managing deep draft ports. So we do a lot, and we'll talk about it here in a bit. We do a lot of export here in the Columbia River, so we're talking deep draft, 43-foot deep channel, loading and unloading ocean-going vessels. And I was with a company called Kinder Morgan for about 9 years doing that. So again, I got a little taste of the downriver piece and the export side and the upriver piece. Spent a little bit of time doing some terminal development projects out of the Port of Stockton for about a year and a half, which was great because I did get that's where I got quite a bit of my work. We did quite a bit of work back in Congress on that project. So it kind of all came together. It was the perfect storm that landed me here a couple of years ago.
And it's the perfect background to talk about kind of the way that we're going to explore the topic today for Marine Highway 84. And in terms of, having seen both sides of it, right? You've been upriver and downriver. What is the magnitude of this overall system for your members, for the folks that you advocate for?
Oh, that's a huge, huge question, and a good one. To say it's impossible to describe. So, but I'll try. It's really vital. And it's kind of this living, breathing system, right? Where you have lower river export ports as this export and import gateway for goods and commodities in and out of the mouth of the Columbia River, being fed, region and really nationwide. We talk about that, where you have these export ports serviced by trucks, serviced by rail, serviced by tug and barge operations that functions and works together as this really flexible supply chain. So the highway, and you mentioned, and I know you've talked about this before, M84 is a federally authorized marine highway. It's really no different than I-5 or I-84, and it's one of just 3 marine highways on the West Coast. So you have M5, M580, which is in the Bay Area, and then M84, which goes the 465 miles up to Lewiston. It's to kind of put numbers, and I told myself I wasn't going to say numbers because I would screw them up. Full disclaimer, if you're a PNWA member and you're listening, I'm trying my best to mention every one of our 150 members and trying my best to get all the numbers right. We have over 150 members, Austin, at PNWA. So we're made up of public ports, tug and barge operators, export grain elevators, union labor, private companies, PUDs, and those membership, mainly Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. We have a couple outliers outside, so I should have mentioned that at the get-go. But the gravity and the complexity comes down to one number, and I like to use this number because this is a real number. $31.2 billion in goods and services cross the Columbia River Bar every year. And that was a number from 2 years ago, right? So there's always a delay, but it's about that much cargo value each year. So it's huge when you talk about the economic driver that ports, river operators, folks that are using this federally authorized marine highway have and interact with each other. So it's vital, it's critical. And again, the upriver piece, right? So Portland all the way up to Lewiston interacts and lays in perfectly with the lower river export elevator piece, which is that 110 miles downriver from Portland to Astoria.
Yeah. And I think it's important, we'll get into this more as the conversation goes on, but it is, an important thing that I've certainly picked up on as I've gotten to spend more time covering this topic and getting out and engaging with some of our own members that overlap with some of yours on the port side of things, understanding the sort of upper versus lower river distinction and getting to really get a grasp of what's taking place, I guess, maybe below Bonneville, where you have like Portland, Vancouver, those folks, versus what's taking place in some of those more higher inland ports.
Yeah, it's a different scale, I guess maybe is one way to put it too. Talking about that, talking about that all-in dollar figure on a tonnage basis, it varies every year, right, depending on markets. Just to put that in perspective, 40 to 45 to 60 million tons of cargo export and import on the Columbia River. It's about 8 million tons of cargo that flows through the Snake River. So mouth of the Snake River into the Columbia. You still have those 4 projects, those 4 navigation locks on the Columbia that we navigate through too. So lower river, maybe we'll start there if that's okay.
Yeah, totally.
Some of the uniqueness and differences and what that looks like, Portland and below, is infrastructure. I just like to talk about infrastructure first. So it's the jetties, the mouth of the Columbia River. People don't think about them. You're out there in Astoria or on the Southwest Washington coast. You see these nice jetties. You wonder when they were built, what the heck the purpose is, and that's the gateway to this supply chain system we talk about, and that has to remain open. And to do that, we channel, and for a long time we've channeled the mouth of the Columbia River to go into the ocean, and that's critical. And maintaining that infrastructure is critical. It's not easy, and we aid and support in doing that. So you have jetties. You have a channel that's 43 feet deep. I mentioned. up until 2010, the channel in the Columbia River from Astoria to Portland was 40 feet deep. And in the 90s, folks got together and said, gosh, if we could deepen this by 3 more feet, we could get a lot more cargo, we could be a lot more competitive on the global market for grain, for one, but for all the other commodities as well. And so you actually had that completed in 2010, about a 20-year process, and in partnership with the federal funds that were used to dredge and deepen the channel to 43 feet, you had over $1 billion in private investment that was done as well, which in today's dollars is almost inflation. Is almost $1.4 billion, mainly at the grain export elevators, to facilitate the transfer of cargo to flow through. It's funny, we don't think of a deep channel as infrastructure, but it is. It needs maintained. And there's infrastructure and costs associated with that. And a lot of that's aging, and so that's something that we're out there advocating for.
This might be a little bit deeper in the weeds on things, but with my, I guess, limited maritime background and spending a little bit of time out on the river as well, as I understand it, is it the depth of the channel basically allows you to carry more cargo? Like the ship itself is going to sit lower in the water with more weight on it, so that's the need for creating that little extra amount there by deepening the channel.
Yep. For those that are listening and not seeing me, I'm nodding my head right now. Yes. Yeah. So one fact, and we like to talk about it, is when you're exporting grain, and that's the largest commodity that we export. So it varies year to year. 33 million tons of grain are exported through the Columbia River. And so that's wheat, and you guys talked about that. Wheat's the big deal. I like that title. Wheat, soybeans, and corn from here. So if you're a foot restricted, so sometimes in the past we would say, okay, well, 40. Let me put it like this: if we had a super dry year, and maybe we'll talk about this when we talk about Columbia River Treaty as well, because I think that plays in. But if you were restricted by a foot, if you for whatever reason couldn't load a foot deeper, that 1 foot that you can't load in cargo equates to about $1 to $1.5 million in commodity value that gets left on the dock. And it's easy to say just left on the dock, but that backs up that whole supply chain. That backs up that export elevator who's managing dozens and dozens of different commodities and grades of cargo in a just-in-time manner, right? Where unit trains are coming in from Montana, barges are coming down from Lewiston, trucks are bringing in different things. It's critical that we get things just in time, just right. So the predictability of the system as a whole, as we've kind of, I've attempted to describe here, is really critical. But yes, in short, if you're at 43 feet, you load that vessel to 43 feet, you're maximizing the cargo carrying capacity in the river. Now, there's vessels of all different sizes too, right? So you can see Panamax vessels, Aframax vessels that are super large. Again, it's an economic play on what vessel is ordered to come here in the river and load, based on what cost and how full do you fill it or how not full do you fill it. So, but just part of the huge calculation that's done.
Yeah. And when we're talking about the lower river also, I mean, we are talking about obviously a section that isn't necessarily as dictated by the dams from a navigable sense, like a lock provides, right? But I'd be curious to hear from your perspective how much, hydropower operations, that sort of thing, does play a role in the navigability of the lower river. Because the Columbia River Bar has a reputation itself for being pretty dicey. I'd imagine there might be some other impacts that take place down there.
Yeah, that's a great question, Austin. I mean, I'll use one example. When there's a lot of, when it's the spring freshet and there's a lot of flow coming down the river system, these projects are opened up, and as you've talked about before on this show, you're managing the projects, the dam, the navlocks are managing all the users of the river system, right? They're managing for fish, for hydro, for recreation, irrigation, and navigation. So they're managing all those things. And sometimes, and if you think about it, all those 8 projects on the Snake and Columbia River, what's up above one dam is going to be eventually what's down below that dam. So eventually that's got to come out. So if you're you're a barge operator, tug and barge operator, and you're pushing barges upriver, and you're doing that during a spring freshet or when spill is ordered to be certain amount, it can be dicey, right? And these are the best. Probably Rob Rich, when he was on your show from Shaver Transportation, I'm sure Rob talked about it. These pilots and captains that crew these vessels are experts and trained in navigating this river system. And it's much better than it was in the 1880s when we were doing it. But it's still dangerous. And that spill and that river flow sometimes means we have to put maybe 2 tugboats on a tow going upriver. Sometimes it means we have to wait. I mean, we've been really lucky to have the efficiency and the predictability we've had over the last 60 years under the Columbia River Treaty, and we just need to maintain that going forward.
Yeah. And when we do start looking at going above Bonneville, kind of what starts to change about the way that the river system is operating up there?
Yeah, I'll mention one big difference. So we've been talking about the 43-foot deep channel.
Yeah.
Down below Bonneville. It's actually up to Portland. So the channel, the federally authorized channel, is 43 feet deep up to Portland, Vancouver. The channel is then authorized to be 27 feet deep up to the Dalles. It's not maintained to 27 feet because there's no need right now for ocean-going vessels to go up to the Dalles. But fun fact, if you Google it, if your listeners get out there and Google the Dalles ocean-going vessels, there's a picture of an ocean-going vessel that called back there a long time ago. So the channel, the congressionally authorized channel changes. And from the Dalles up to Lewiston, that channel is congressionally authorized at 14 feet deep and 250 feet wide. So that's probably the biggest difference is, and it makes sense, right? We're talking about this, if you cross the Astoria or Longview Bridge, it's a big, deep river. They call it the Mighty Columbia for a reason. And then upriver, it's not so much, right? But we're still using it for efficient and safe navigation on the river system. So when we're talking downriver, we're talking these deep draft ports like Portland and Longview and Kalama and Vancouver, and I'm missing many more, but that are moving a large amount of volume and a large amount of cargo on individual vessels, on one vessel. When you're upriver, you've got a barge, and for your listeners, I probably should have led with this. A barge of wheat is nominally 3,500 tons. Okay, and it depends. There's multiple different sizes out there, but basically one barge is about 3,500 tons. One tow, and a tow is made up of 4 barges and one tugboat that pushes those 4 barges. One tow is about 14,000 tons. So for one tugboat pushing downriver or upriver. And I'm using wheat. We move a lot more commodities on the river system than just wheat. And that's the most efficient way to move cargo. So when you're loading an ocean-going vessel, and I'm jumping back and forth between up and downriver, you're putting 50,000 tons onto one of those ocean-going vessels. So just trying to put into scale what's moving on the river upriver and what's moving on the river downriver. Mm-hmm. That 4-barge tow is designed perfectly to fit into these navigation locks. So all 8 projects from Lewiston all the way down to Bonneville, those nav locks are the same size. Mm-hmm. And you're fitting a tow, which is 650 feet long by 84 feet wide, into one of those, and you're fully utilizing that space. The other commodities that we're moving, we talk a lot about grain. Upriver, we're moving a lot of logs and wood chips and wood products. We're moving gravel. A lot of petroleum and renewable fuels move upriver. A lot of folks don't realize that's how much of Eastern Washington is supplied with their fuel, is upriver from the Portland, Vancouver terminals up to the Tri-Cities where it gets distributed to Eastern Washington. So we got, Fairchild Air Force Base, and you got a lot of firefighting that occurs. They're getting their jet fuel a lot of times from being barged upriver, and renewable fuels as well. So that's pretty. I'm sure I'm missing some other commodities, but those are some of the main ones that are moving upriver.
Yeah, and I think too, it's maybe to kind of, as I'm sitting here trying to think about how the listeners might be interpreting some of this. I mean, I think it's worth kind of pointing out, as I understand it, when we're talking about Portland and that port right there, a lot of that is, like you said, those ocean-going vessels, and then a lot of that is either being loaded onto or coming off of barges. So kind of there's like an exchange point between the larger ships and these smaller ships.
Yep. Yeah, those we call them terminals because goods are terminaled on or off of different modes of transportation.
Mm.
And barging fits right into that. One example is wind components. So wind energy components come into the lower river. They generally go into either the Port of Longview or the Port of Vancouver, and those wind components can be loaded either directly from those ocean-going vessels, or they get offloaded onto the dock and then loaded onto barges. And then they go on barges, and we've moved wind components, every component, the blade, the nacelle, which is the motor, upriver to Lewiston. Again, it's the most efficient way, safest way to move cargo and commodities on the river system.
It is kind of funny, we talk so much about the relationship between hydropower and other renewable energies from a sort of a load following perspective, talking about hydropower being able to essentially act like a battery backup for those resources. But obviously, as you're describing, they also have another value, which is actually making it possible to build some of these other renewables.
It is, and when we're talking about those proponents of wind, those blades are getting taller, bigger and bigger all the time. And the challenge that they run into with importing those into the lower river is getting them out of the ports. Like they physically, in a lot of cases, when these blade sizes get bigger, they can't get them out of the ports. So a lot of problems. That's probably a whole nother podcast, Austin.
I certainly, there's probably been some times where it's good I wasn't podcasting or in front of a microphone, because I've, done some trips back and forth, and when those turbines get stuck, on the highway, when they're not going on a barge, certainly it can make for a challenging travel experience. But speaking of challenging travel experiences, we talked a little bit about the spill and the operations of the river and some of those effects lower down. But once we get, again, up above Bonneville, we're now kind of in the, I feel like really the heart of the marine highway system. What kind of challenges could a barge operator expect to face as far as, whether it's the conditions, whether it's the operations? What sort of challenges do those folks run into?
I mean, again, I've never operated a tugboat or barge, but I've heard a lot of sea stories. We talked about the spill, and we talked about flow of the river. You get a big flow, and the flow is measured in 1,000 cubic foot per second. So you get a big KCFS flow. You might be challenged to put more power on to move it up or move it down. When you have different spill patterns, that's another thing that we work really closely with our members that are tug and barge operators. So spill pattern for folks listening, you have this huge spillway, and they're opening and closing certain spillway gates at a certain time, and that's all in the Corps of Engineers is managing that. As you're coming with a tow, or Austin, a cruise ship, and that's another. We talk a lot about cargo that's moved on the river system here. I haven't mentioned yet that the Columbia Snake River is huge for cruising, and it's a huge burgeoning cruise industry where there's a lot of investments in clean fuel vessels being built purposely for our river system here. So a lot of folks that wouldn't otherwise get to travel out and see this scenic Columbia River Gorge and points further east are able to do that. But think about it. Now you've got a cruise ship that's going into a navigation lock, headed upriver towards Lewiston, and you have this spill pattern. It's very critical that be managed and communicated with the operators of the vessels and with the Corps of Engineers. And our membership at PNW have a great relationship with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They're professionals. They're safe. They communicate well back and forth. But that being said, it's a dangerous operation, and so you can get sometimes these spill patterns, if not done according to procedure, that can kind of create eddies and can create the potential to move the vessel where you don't want the vessel to move into. So that's a potential safety issue. As far as just driving tugs and barges, it can get foggy here,
Mm-hmm.
And the same in the lower river. You can hear those big foghorns blowing. Unfortunately, we've had wildfires from time to time. So I like to always tell folks, and when I was working at the barge company, when you look at how often highways are closed, and they're closed a few times a year around here for freezing rain, for fog, for mudslides, the river is not closed near that much. And so it's a very, again, I hate to overuse the term predictable system, but I mean, all of Clark County's municipal solid waste is barged from Vancouver upriver to Boardman, Oregon. And that has to happen because does nobody want their trash can piling up on their curb kind of thing. And so, luckily for us in Clark County residents, our commodities moving up in containers, our solid waste is moving up on containers up the river. So that's just one thing that people don't see. And you know what? I don't want to see my trash moving. I just want it to go away.
I think we can all get that one for sure. As far as just to expand on that a little bit too, when we're talking about the river, I mean, I think there's maybe a notion, a false notion, if you will, that the reservoirs behind the dams, given run-of-the-river dams, but they're still technically a reservoir. These reservoirs are not, there's no flow to them. They describe them a lot of times as being like stagnant, for example, things like that. But, obviously you don't get eddies without some sort of current flowing through there. So I imagine at times you could end up with a pretty significant flow of water that, especially trying to go upriver could create some of these challenging conditions you're describing. And, I also know, obviously the gorge itself is well known for its wind and being a great place for things like kite surfing. But I would, just kind of putting two and two together, I could imagine sometimes the water can get pretty rough out there between the current and the wind.
It's brutal. I mean, I've shared some stuff even on some social media of, I think last winter, there was a captain that said, he went outside, he measured, it was 110 miles an hour wind, and they're pushing a 4-barge tow up the river. Again, these folks are trained to operate in these austere conditions. But I just challenge anyone, as a passenger, not as a driver, when you're driving up the Columbia River Gorge and you're looking out and it's a windy day and you're watching those windsurfers, you can see the barges moving up and down the river. You can see the cruise vessels. When that wind is moving up, is going up the gorge and the river's coming down, and again, apologize for your listeners, I'm putting my hands back and forth like this. You get some pretty good wave action on the river system. And it's totally safe. But, the equipment can take a beating. And so that's one other thing of we've got to maintain this equipment. We've got to maintain this infrastructure on this river system.
And the maintenance of that infrastructure is probably the best segue into what I wanted to ask you about next, which is when it comes to the challenges to the marine highway itself. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack there. We've had conversations on this podcast about concerns with regard to breaching some dams. You've mentioned the Columbia River Treaty several times. There's a lot of factors at play, and I'd just be curious, from your perspective, what kind of threats to the operation of that infrastructure and the continued use of Marine Highway 84 are really kind of the most pressing at this this time?
Sure. Lower Snake River dams are critical to the full operation of this marine highway. If you, and I hate to say it, but if those weren't there, you wouldn't, those commodities wouldn't move, period. If those dams weren't there, and this is getting into kind of the value and how, how important it is to those farmers who are growing wheat. There's on average here, there's 4 million tons of wheat. Hopefully my number matches Michelle's. 4 million tons of wheat that's moved just on the Snake River alone. So that's a whole nother conversation around the economics and what would it look like if you didn't have those dams there. And it's pretty dramatic, and I can touch on that in a bit. But specific to challenges, if those weren't there, we would would have some pretty serious concerns. We have some pretty serious concerns. Let me just I want to follow up on the Columbia River Treaty, and then we'll come back to the Snake River Dam.
Yeah,
if that's
yeah.
Okay. Columbia River Treaty is a 60-year-old treaty that expired last September 2024. Great. It was an agreement between the U.S. and Canada. It's an hour-long podcast in and of itself. So if you're listening and you're like, I don't even know what that means, please just do a quick Google search. But what it means for river navigation and irrigation is, again, is predictability in those flows on the river system. So think about it like this. Most of the storage, and you mentioned reservoir storage, right? We have run-of-the-river dams generally on these 8 projects in Columbia Snake. But on the upriver piece on the Columbia, so Grand Coulee and points up into Canada, that's where most of the water storage takes place. So when you think about the likelihood of Portland or Vancouver flooding, that likelihood's really low because we have this amazing system that manages our water flow. We have pre-planned flood control in Canada. And in the previous treaty that expired in September, I'm gonna geek out and use numbers, but this might help this might help. We had about 8.95 million acre feet of pre-planned flood control with Canada. So a million acre foot, what is that? Well, it's a million acres a foot deep, okay? Think about it like that in a volume perspective. In this new treaty that's still being negotiated between the U.S. and Canada, and that's a negotiation that the State Department leads with BPA and the Corps, the pre-planned flood control is nominally about half of that. And so, again, there's a lot of other intricacies about this treaty and some good things, some not so good things, but just purely from a navigation irrigation standpoint, when you have that much less pre-planned flood control, you have to rely on flood control on the U.S. side of the border. So operationally, things will change. And we've known this, and we've worked with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and others, we've said, hey, you're going to be negotiating, we want to see predictability, we want to see the same efficiencies we've seen. When you've operated a river system with levees, pile dikes, dredging, infrastructure all along the river system the same way for 60 years, and then you go and change it, what's going to happen? And so a couple realistic examples are our bridges, our levees. If you have this fluctuating river now that maybe the high flows are much higher and much harder, and the low flows are much shallower and slower, what does that do to sedimentation transport in the river system? What does that mean for dredging? We have a budget that we go after every year to dredge the lower Columbia River to keep that channel open. How is that going to change in this new operational regime? How are those flows going to change? So in 1,000 cubic feet per second coming out of Bonneville, what is that going to look like versus in the past? And just even the last month or two, PNWA and our stakeholders have had some great conversations with the Corps and around understanding what does the data show from their models and what does that actually mean. So the risk is still there, but I think we can all be reassured that the Corps is working in our best interests to mitigate any potential changes. And rest assured that PNWA and our 150 members, and really I have about 45 members who are fully engaged. We call it the Columbia River Treaty Strike Team, Austin. Yeah. Who are fully engaged in monitoring that and participating. It's giving feedback to the Corps. Hey, this is an impact. This is something maybe you haven't thought about previously. So I bring that up as a threat to the overall system. We have to manage. We have to communicate. We can't just, we have to make decisions with the full system involved. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think given the conversations that have previously been had on the podcast too, there's a consistent theme when it comes to the transportation side of things with regard to the value of reliability and predictability in the river system. And so I think the thing that is evident here as well is how important it is to have that communication, to have all these factors at play that you're working towards with regard to the treaty to ensure that reliability continues regardless of maybe what operational changes could be coming.
And it's Exactly. And it's, we talk about the PNW region, we talk about Washington and Oregon and Idaho farmers, but those farmers in the Midwest that are loading up trains and rail cars of soybeans and corn, they rely on our efficient system to export. So, excuse me, again, 60% of U.S. wheat exports out the Columbia River. Not all that comes down from the Snake. A lot of that is brought in. A lot of the corn and soy is railed in. So again, we think of the Columbia Snake River as this living, breathing supply chain. It's part of this greater export, where if I'm a farmer in the Midwest, I've got to rely on exporting out the Mississippi and the Gulf Coast. I've got to rely on my rail, but I'm also relying on what's happening out here in the PNW, and this is a huge part of it.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes it's hard for people to even wrap their heads around this idea of, making such a journey from the Midwest, specifically all kind of aiming it towards the Pacific Northwest and the Columbia River system. But again, I think it really speaks to how critical it is that we, I think, provide something unique here, as I have come to understand it, in being able to reliably provide that transportation.
Yeah. If I can jump back slightly, can I jump back?
Oh yeah, yeah. Let's do it.
Before I jumped onto the treaty stuff, I was mentioning Lower Snake River dams, and you'd asked about the threats, to the system and Lower Snake River Dam removal is one. What I like to articulate to folks, and we did an independent socioeconomic study a couple of years ago, and we just asked the question, what does this mean if these dams come out? And again, probably multiple other podcasts around that. One of them was as simple as the water table. So the water table goes away, wells decrease, well depth decreases, so you've got to dig deeper for water. Wells are going to dry up. You're going to lose the ability to it's common sense to me, but we've had to explain this to people. When you remove a dam, anyone on the system, if you removed Ice Harbor, and Ice Harbor for folks that are listening is the one closest to the Tri-Cities, it's the last dam and navigation lock, last meaning farthest downstream on the Snake River. If you remove that, you're not getting any farther up to Lewiston. So having the other 3 still in service does you no good if you're going to try and export wheat to market. So if you're a farmer, and again, this has probably been discussed way better than I would, but I'll summarize and say, if you're a farmer in Eastern Washington and you're barely making ends meet supply chain wise now, with the price of wheat and with your transportation costs, now you don't have that efficient mode of transportation. You're not going to be able to ship wheat. You're not going to be able to produce wheat, and that's dry land farm. You're pretty restricted in what you're able to grow. So the farms go out of business, right? The tax base dries up. And this was again studied. The funding for police and fire and all that goes away and dries up. So I'm not trying to paint a bleak picture, Austin, sorry. But it's a set of dominoes that falls that I think a lot of people overlook, really.
Yeah. And I kind of feeding into that and maybe expanding on that a little bit more, I mean, just how critical is the value itself of those 4 dams? Again, they are part of this larger system, but I mean, is there a viable system there without those 4 dams in place?
They did a study. There was a study done, and I was looking at this the other day. It would be about 201, I think it'd be around 201 unit trains to replace just barging of wheat on the system. That's one of many aspects that you could look at around how do you replace, and I'm doing air quotes here, how do you replace the value of that system? It's just not physically possible to put that many trains on the rail system. There's no infrastructure there to do that right now that would be able to take that over. The value, when I think value and I think in numbers, I think in tons, I think in dollars, and I was doing some rough math. I read an article this morning. The price of wheat is still pretty depressed. It's around maybe $6 a bushel or something like that. If you do the math on that, it's $1 billion in just wheat commodity that would move on the Snake River system. So that's a huge value that's a huge value there.
On the flip side of things, what does it take to keep the whole system operating smoothly? We've talked a lot about what makes it not operate smoothly, but when we're trying to actually, keep things in order, keep that reliability in place, what sort of things have to happen to make that possible?
Everything. No, I'm glad you asked this because I feel like I've been there's this stuff just excites me just because it's fun to talk about, and there's so much to talk about again. So I feel like we've been jumping around, but I'm glad you asked this, Austin, because it's a living, breathing supply chain, and it's what I like to equate it to is you have farmers in Washington, Oregon, Montana, all the way back to the Midwest, like we've talked about. So it takes people, it takes users who need the system. They need to get their commodities to market. It takes the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It takes the government. They're the ones responsible for maintaining the channel. And again, they're the ones responsible for maintaining the 8 nav locks on the river system. It's not just, it's a channel. It's like I mentioned before. It's jetties, it's pile dikes, it's dredging. The Corps of Engineers operates several dredges. Some are designated to the West Coast and to this river system. The Port of Portland operates a dredge. It's called the Dredge Oregon. They operate it in contract to the Corps to do the work for the Corps in the lower river on behalf of the lower river ports. So there's a lot of interaction and interplay between those that need the system, those that maintain the system, and I mentioned the ports, the lower river ports and the upper river ports, who are investing in infrastructure, who are enabling economic development and growth for the communities to do that. I take it a step further and talk about shipbuilders. I mean, I mentioned the cruise vessels. We have one particular cruise line that operates vessels here. They own their own shipyard. They build their own vessels. And that's amazing. It's investing in America. It's investing in our infrastructure. Those petroleum barges that are moving liquid fuels and renewable fuels on the river system, those are state-of-the-art, double hold. It's not just a dumb barge that's just sitting out there. There's a big investment that goes in. We build a lot of those. Not me. Even here in the Columbia River. So it's all of those people and those interactions, I think, that keep this whole system operating smoothly. And by the way, you got to pay for it. So it's folks like PNWA members who go back to DC, and folks like Northwest River Partners who advocate for these systems to be maintained and to have money spent to invest in that infrastructure.
I think when it comes down to it, ultimately we talk about so much of the challenge, as we have today about dam removal and the concerns we have there. What does that ultimately mean at the end of the day for Marine Highway 84, for really any of the 8 dams that are in that system? As you said, I think, alluding with Lower Snake, or the Lower Granite Dam in particular as one example. But, I mean, really, as I've come to understand it, it seems like every single one of those 8 dams is just really irreplaceable when it comes to keeping the system operating.
Yeah, you're right, Austin. And one of the things, again, when you think about the secondary and tertiary effects that you don't think about offhand, or advocates for breaching maybe don't think about or don't want to think about, it's easy to say, take tug and barge company X, and gosh, you know what, now let's just remove half these dams, and instead we can, I'm being facetious, I have my facetious face on, Austin, and instead let's just load it all in Tri-Cities. Let's take all that stuff that would be up there, we'll subsidize it, and you can truck it down from eastern Washington and Idaho, you can truck it down to Tri-Cities and load there, because the Snake River dams will be gone. Never mind the huge problem you'd have trying to find enough truck drivers and trucks. That's never going to happen. But to say that a barge company X would stay in business, is an assumption that you just can't assume. A cruise vessel company is going to go out of business, and the trickle down effect of that shipyard then having to potentially close because they're not building vessels, the farmers going out of business, those secondary and tertiary effects, I think, are really critical. One other example that came up just recently as again, there's some studies being undertaken right now at Washington in partnership with the Corps. I'm sure there's a transportation study in Washington State. There's a water supply study in Washington State. That again is probably a whole nother podcast, but Google those if you're listening and you want to learn more about them. And we're paying very close attention to those studies, and there was a comment made. Well, gosh, we asked the question. We said, well, how can you assure us that these terminals at Tri-Cities, think around Pasco area, just downstream from Ice Harbor, at the mouth of the Snake, how can you assure us that those terminals can even operate? Well, right, like on paper, they're below Ice Harbor, so it shouldn't matter. But when you really start to think about what is that sediment transport going to look like? What is the lack of predictability in flows going to mean for those terminals? Some pretty significant terminals there, fuel and otherwise, that are really in jeopardy if you did something like that. So I guess I would encourage, and I talked about some other threats before, but I just would encourage people to just ask, what if? You just ask, what if this? And then take it to the second step and the third effect as well, to really just get smart on what that really means.
Yeah. I guess maybe one of those many what if scenarios is, to go through even that transition period. Say you're able to pull off, successful removal of the lower Snake. You transition everything to the Tri-Cities. But I've heard this maybe, I guess, from an agricultural perspective. So I'm curious from a transportation perspective if it's sort of the similar thing. That even just the transition process, the sort of uncertainty in the short term that would be created while you're trying to make the transition to a whole new way of operating that system. I mean, I would imagine you might lose some of the market competitiveness to be able to keep, as you said, some of those barge operators might just cease to stay in business because, there might not be a long-term future worth staying in it for when the short term is so disastrous.
Right. That I can't say it any better. I mean, I totally agree, Austin. And there's so many unknowns that it's really difficult. It's challenging to speculate, what that looks like. But that's a great example. We're struggling. It's hard to get investments in infrastructure, right? We're going to be you can talk about the I-5 bridge replacement. You can talk about other big, high dollar. And so when you really start talking about, huge rail terminals or truck terminals or whatever it's going to take, it's time, it's money, and there's a cost environmentally too. And so when we talk about what's the cost to emissions and the carbon cost, there's a lot that needs to be unpacked, I think. And we've done some of that unpacking, and it points to we already have the safest, most efficient way to move commodities here right now. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned some of these studies as well, and I know it's something that our both organizations have been paying a lot of attention to closely, and so I'd imagine as well that we probably have some similar goals and how we want to tackle some of those things. And one of them is to make sure that we're getting a lot of support for the work that we're doing, that we're getting more everyday people involved, and that's the sort of people we're trying to reach with this podcast. So I'd love to hear from you how someone can support PNWA's work, what they can do to get involved. And obviously you described at the top kind of the non-profit structural part of what PNWA is, but from just a pure, grassroots support level, how someone wants to get out and help what you're doing, what's the best way they can do that?
I mean, I would say it's twofold. And one fold is my sales pitch, but it's get educated. If you're listening and you're not part of an association, or you're not part of a company or an industry, and you just care about what goes on here, you just care that when you turn your light switch on, you're going to have power. When you go to your grandma's house to make sure she's got heat this winter, that she's got heat. The price of bread. Just think about those things and where they come from. One challenge for us is, and this is why we love our partnership with the Power folks, because it's really easy to explain the light switch to folks. it's a little more difficult to explain, well, you got that, pastry that was imported from Japan because that's soft white wheat that exported to Japan. That was, it takes it a little farther, but it's not that far off, right? When you're in Eastern Washington and you're filling up your truck with diesel, think about where that comes from. So I know it's not what you asked, but it's getting educated, and asking questions. When I've done some events with Austin and with Clark, and it's surprising that folks don't realize, for one example, how great fish returns are and what the fish numbers actually are on this river system, and how much money is being spent on habitat restoration. So I just would encourage people to understand the facts and get educated. Go visit the infrastructure yourself, right? Go out, go up to Bonneville and see the fish ladders and see the fish count. Go out to Astoria and take a look at the jetties and walk around safely out there. If you are an association or organization that wants to get involved and doesn't know how, reach out to us. Reach out to PNWA, pnwa.net, and say, how can you help? The benefit of an association like PNWA, one of the benefits is we have this huge diversity in our membership. And that makes us stronger. That makes us, when we go to advocate in Congress, or when we go to testify in Congress, or do something here regionally, I'm not the expert. I'm just the guy just sitting here in Austin's office, which is really finely decorated, I must say. But our members are the experts. And so, let your voice be heard, speak up. PNWA, I mentioned it before, if you touch a federal waterway in any manner, we're talking here just about the Columbia Snake River system. We're on the Oregon coast, we're in the Puget Sound as well, and a lot of the issues are the same, surprisingly.
Well, you talked about that diversity of membership, and I think that is kind of the next logical place to kind of go from there, which is the people that listen to this podcast, hopefully by now, if they're regular listeners, have sort of taken on a little bit of hydropower advocacy. They're taking more interest in the issues, and they are becoming more educated on some of these things. I'd love to know from your perspective how critical the overlap between hydropower advocacy and transportation advocacy is, and if you're already deeply invested or deeply interested in one, why getting involved or taking up interest in the other is of value to you.
It's again, I'm nodding my head aggressively here, because you hit it on the head, Austin. A lot, the goal is the same. The goal is maintain the system that we have now. The reasons are different, and when you talk to people, or other power associations are out talking to people, generally, to your point, they're power people. So when folks like you, and I'm using you as the example, can throw in some navigation facts, can talk about agriculture, and can check a couple more boxes. For me, it's the opposite, right? For me, it's when I'm talking to navigation and irrigation folks, and I throw in the fact that in 10 years this region's going to need 30% more power. Poof, it blows their minds, because they're not thinking about, some of the people we work with and talk to aren't thinking about power. So I think it just exponentially just takes our argument and our facts and just blows them up exponentially. So I really encourage, and I've been able to grow relationships with folks on the public power side here in the last year and a half. It's huge, and it takes our message and just really amplifies it. It's like putting 5 microphones in front of the message that we have. And when we go back to DC as PNWA, and when we can sit in front of a staffer or a member of Congress and say, gosh, I just had a conversation with Clark Mather about this issue, or I was on the phone with Scott Sims and Kurt Miller said this, and I'm not name dropping, I'm really talking to these people. It really sends this strong, unified message to our members of Congress, to the public, to the decision makers. That's so important. It's so important. It doesn't mean we agree all the time on every topic. We don't. But having that communication between the associations and between these vested parties is just so critical. So again, if you're a listener and you're historically just a an advocate for tugboats. I would encourage you to be an advocate for hydropower, and vice versa. If you're a hydropower person that's that geeks out on turbines in Bonneville. By the way, I listened to that podcast. I can't remember what her name was. It was awesome.
Oh, the fish friendly turbines.
Yes, yeah. Anyway, to expand out into these other things that are just exciting and just give us all a little more, awareness of how big this issue really is, I think is so important.
Yeah. Well, that that's why we have you here today, right? I mean, it's exactly what we're trying to do with this episode of the podcast, and I really appreciate you making the time to do so. And hopefully we covered most of it. If there's anything we missed, I know, as you mentioned, we could probably do a couple more hours worth on just individual topics, but as far as trying to really cover the whole system in a crash course, I feel like we did a pretty good job.
I hope so. I hope people aren't just sitting there scratching their heads right now. But it is fun to talk about, and there is so much, and it's just so integral to what happens on this on this lower river system to what happens on the upper river system every day.
Yeah.
I just can't thank you enough for having me on and for listening. The partnership that we've had with you all and with Power's been great, and there's a lot more educating to do. So.
Absolutely. The work continues, and I guess the podcast continues as well, because we do have the final thing here. I know you're a listener of the podcast, you're a fan of the podcast, so I can probably spare you and everyone listening the usual long rambling that I have to do to try and explain how we end up at this final question. But I give everybody at the end of the episode an opportunity to share their life advice, because I think it's a great way to get to know the guest better rather than just getting all down in the weeds about the topics we cover. And that's a big thing we want to do, is make sure that people get to know not only what we're talking about, but also the people doing the work, and really the human aspect of the type of advocacy that we're all working towards. So without further ado, the floor is yours. Anything you've got as far as either life advice you live by or something that's inspired you recently, we'd all love to hear it.
It's funny, Austin, I prepped for everything except for this one question, and I I knew it was coming. Oh, that's funny, and you caught me off guard. I like to have fun. I like to work hard, and I like to have fun. And if you've been able to if I've seen you around at a presentation or at a conference or something like that, again, I like to have fun. That's important, because what we're doing here is hard work. It's hard work day in and day out. So being able, I think, to take a step back and relate to one another and build relationships and bonds in what we're doing, and bring a little brevity to a situation. That's kind of my style. I know it's not everybody's. I still like to get a little serious from time to time. And if you're having fun and joking and laughing when you get serious, people really listen. I've noticed that. So that's really, I don't know, Austin. That's probably it. Is don't take yourself too seriously, especially in what we're doing here. It's so important. But at the same time, we can't burn out. We're in it for the long run here, and just embracing those relationships and those people that prop us up and support us in the work that we're all doing, and I'm talking to everybody that's listening out there, is huge. And that's what makes it fun, and that's what makes me get up every day, and enjoying the people in and around this industry.
I couldn't agree with you more. Now I'm the one nodding in agreement that no one can see.
He was.
But I think the thing that I would just add on to that is, especially given some of the stuff that we tackle, I know all too well that there's days where it's we have to try and find a way to keep it fun and keep it light, because it can get pretty serious at times. So I know that that's not unique to the work we do, and a lot of people out there experience that as well, and hopefully we can set a good example for those who need it. So yeah, really appreciate it. Absolutely. And thank you again for taking the time to join us, not only to be part of the podcast and to tell the PNWA story, but also for coming into the studio today and making it happen.
I loved it. This was great, Austin. Thanks so much for having me.
A huge thanks to Neil for joining us on this latest installment of DAM. In much the same way that Northwest River Partners represents a broad membership across the greater Northwest, the Pacific Northwest Waterways Association represents a wide array of members who depend on the critical navigation services of the Columbia and Snake River dams. Neil's perspective reflects this, and the information he shared on this episode adds so much more to our expanding catalog of transportation-focused podcasts. I'll also add that our partnership has helped us better represent our overlapping members and unite the Northwest in new and powerful ways. The broad coalition supporting hydropower is only growing stronger, and I'm glad that you, as a listener of this podcast, are an important part of that. If you're enjoying our coverage of this topic, please let us know. And if you're interested in other topics or guests appearing on DAM, I strongly encourage you to reach out with those suggestions. The first way to do so is to use our contact form on nwriverpartners.org, or send an email directly to info@nwriverpartners.org. You can also make your voice heard by submitting a review on your favorite listening platform. Just know that every positive review helps DAM grow, as does subscribing and turning on new notifications for episodes. While you're at it, make sure to share the show with everyone you know, and check us out on social media at NW River Partners on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, and X. Thanks as always for being one of our amazing DAM listeners, and until next time, see ya.